and welcome to the second webcast of the Oregon City Together team. We are talking about drug and alcohol abuse, specifically with a specific focus tonight on marijuana use for young adults and youth. My name is Bill Stewart. I'm with the Clackamas County District Attorney's Office. Tonight we are very fortunate to be joined by a good friend of mine, Dr. Andy Mendenhall, who, I want to read this to make sure I get it right, Andy, is the outpatient medical director for Hazelden, which is part of the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation in Tualatin, as I understand it. Beaverton, excuse me.
Close enough.
Close enough, okay. And our partner, Elizabeth Russell, who's the executive director of the City Together. So, Andy, to start off with, it is November 20th as we film this. There's been a big change in the world as it relates to marijuana. It's going to be legal very soon in Oregon as of July 1 for adults for recreational use. So the first question I have is, why should a parent be concerned about their kids using marijuana?
Well, it's a really important question, Bill, and thank you. It's great to be here. The most important thing for a parent to know is to recognize that the brain of their child will not be fully developed until they are in their mid-20s. So 3 to 5 years after college. And there is more and more emerging evidence from long-term, very high-quality studies looking at brain development and the progression of mental illness and brain development and IQ change over 15 to 20-year periods of time in large sample sizes that show very clearly that cannabis use in young adulthood changes how the brain develops, causes permanent IQ loss, and dramatically increases the risk for future development of significant psychiatric disease.
Well, wow, that's very, very scary stuff. I guess, at what level of use do you have to be to experience those kind of problems?
What's interesting is that the developing brain is really sensitive. And the studies from New Zealand and the studies from the Netherlands have shown very good evidence that all they needed to do was include patients that, or rather young adults, that used once a week for a 12-month period of time. So we're talking about using marijuana 52 times in a sample size on average between, or sample age on average between the ages of 17 and 21. That led in a European study to clear evidence of a 500%, a five-fold increased risk for the development of depression, anxiety disorders, psychosis, and bipolar disorder 20 years down the road. In a similar study done in New Zealand, published over the last 2 years, sample size of about 1,500 young adults followed over a 20-year period of time, there was permanent loss of between 6 and 8 IQ points and good evidence of problems with further future executive function and decision making, meaning making good decisions, making complex decisions that required significant emotional insight. Permanent losses in those features associated with using marijuana once a week for a 12-month period of time during early adulthood.
What is it about marijuana that is having that kind of effect on the brain? I mean, what are the mechanics of that loss of IQ or challenges with mental illness?
I can't give you a good answer to that, unfortunately. What we do know is that the brain has an immense capacity to auto-regulate. By that I mean, when people use marijuana, the cannabis binds to cannabinoid receptors. And what's very interesting is there are cannabinoid receptors throughout much of the brain. So there's a pervasive effect over many brain regions, actually more than some other substances. That said, what goes up must come down. So when there's a euphorogenic reward and the brain's dopamine level goes up, the brain automatically tries to shut that process down. Over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been good evidence in the field of epigenetics that part of the way in which the brain creates change in response to elevated levels of dopamine and elevations in what we would consider to be normal neurotransmitter levels is that the brain changes how DNA is read and changes the levels of protein that are expressed. We do know in laboratory examples of chronic cannabis use models that there are changes in how neurons talk to each other at what we call the dendritic level. So it's hypothesized that a combination of epigenetic changes affecting brain dopamine levels, dopamine receptor levels, endogenous cannabinoid receptor levels, and then also the dendritic changes that take place, particularly in early childhood development and in, I should say, post-adolescent development, are probably implicated in this process, but I can't give you hard evidence at this point.
It's interesting. I'm thinking back to when I was in high school and drinking at parties and making jokes about how we were killing brain cells. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if you could kind of, just given what we're learning, and I realize we really are kind of just learning it because there hasn't been a lot of research on cannabis and its effect on the developing brain, but how do they compare? I mean, now we hear more of the conversation about how, well, pot is safer than alcohol, and and I'm also curious about how what you're describing actually does, in a kid's mind, get reduced down to just a joke about killing brain cells. Can you just talk a little bit about those two things, alcohol and marijuana, and how those might be different?
Absolutely, Elizabeth. Great question. So when we think about killing brain cells, in reality, in certain instances, absolutely, brain cells meaning neurons, are likely being damaged. The questions are really related to whether we're killing neurons in the brain or not, a person's killing neurons in their brain or not. We do know that the brain shuts down those neurons. Mm-hmm, they become less functional. Mm-hmm. There's good evidence over the last 15 years with PET scan imaging that, again, when people experience euphoria, they also experience a rebound dysphoria because the brain is so good at auto-regulating, it shuts down, and we can see there's very elegant data that large brain regions actually become less active over time. So that's the correlate to brain cells being destroyed. We do know that there's a direct toxic effect of alcohol on neurons, and we know that the process of alcohol withdrawal is far more dangerous and far more physically demanding, if you will, of medical management than cannabis withdrawal. But we do know as well, as we're seeing higher concentrations of cannabis, that there's actually a cannabis withdrawal scale that has been clinically validated, and we're having to manage people through a significant process of cannabis withdrawal as well. So
then pot's addictive? I mean, this is a bit of a public controversy. I mean, people think it's not. You can call it dependency, it's not addiction, or is it?
Absolutely.
I mean, with withdrawal symptoms, it seems to indicate that it is.
There's a physiologic dependency that happens, and what we have to look at behind that is addiction is really a disease of brain reward and ultimately a disease of self-medication of feelings to avoid feelings and or to repetitively experience the euphorogenic reward of the drug. And when people are progressed from having a mild substance use disorder where the social or personal impacts of their chemical use are more mild as compared to further on down the progression, their attachment, the brain's attachment, and the priority which the behavior of using the drug becomes far and far greater over time. So I think a lot of the sort of colloquial belief that marijuana is not addictive comes from the fact that many people that are dependent on marijuana who use it regularly are still quite socially functional. So the social trajectory of somebody that is, shall we say, a stoner or regular cannabis user can be that of somebody that, while we might not want them behind the wheel while they're deeply under the influence, oftentimes they're fairly functional. That doesn't necessarily mean that that person is not deeply attached to the use of cannabis. Many of us have a vision of what alcoholism looks like, and many people who are alcohol dependent are actually quite functional. Many of us have a vision of what that doesn't look like in terms of a person being non-functional with alcoholism in late stage or methamphetamine addiction or heroin addiction. So I've often said that the social trajectory of somebody who uses cannabis as their drug of choice is often very different from an alcoholic or somebody who's addicted to a harder drug.
So I want to kind of unpack that issue about addiction. If one uses alcohol or one uses marijuana, it feels good. Why is that a problem for a young person, a 15, 16-year-old young person, to start using that because it makes them feel good?
Thanks for the clarification. The evidence says that if a person begins their drug or alcohol use history before the age of 21, it dramatically increases the probability that they're going to develop addictive disease.
So that's true for both alcohol and marijuana?
Absolutely. That's true for both alcohol and marijuana. There was a statement by a significant person in the addiction field who said that if we could push off alcohol use among the entire U.S. population to the first use of alcohol happening beyond the age of 21, at or beyond the age of 21, that the bulk of the alcohol-related disease in America would probably be reduced dramatically. What we know about marijuana in young adults is that there is, all told, among all marijuana users, about a 10% rate of marijuana addiction among people who use cannabis. So there's a 1 in 10 risk that a person's going to need help to change their cannabis use behavior. If a young adult starts using marijuana before the age of 18, the probability that they will need help to discontinue marijuana increases to between 17 and 18%. And when we consider that among the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, 60% of our residential admissions to our youth facility in Plymouth, Michigan, are for cannabis dependence in young adulthood, we see the effects. We see the effects of this behavior happening very, very early. And ultimately what we see are young adults who have their future at their fingertips. But because of the attachment that happens to being under the influence and feeling the euphoria of being under the influence of cannabis, that becomes the priority.
You know, I've heard you talk about that before, where you talk about what happens when the brain, it's not like one drink or one smoke of marijuana will necessarily lead to addiction, but there's a process in the brain that goes on. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit about, I guess, that happiness or that pleasure response? Exactly.
That euphoria comes from our reptilian part of our brain. And what we have to understand about addiction is it's really a survival-based pathway of the brain that is conserved throughout the animal kingdom. So the parts of our brain that give us reward for having a full belly, the parts of our brain that give us a reward for engaging in reproductive activity, release the neurotransmitter dopamine. And dopamine is the sort of everything is well in the world feeling, right? And at the risk of being inappropriate, I often say in talks, well, there are 8.5 billion people in the world, so the last time I checked, reproductive activity was felt good and reinforcing in that sense. What we have to remember is that drug and alcohol use releases between 50 and 10,000 times the amount of dopamine that reproductive activity does. So our brains as human beings are very efficient at remembering high dopamine states. And the young adult in that developing brain is more susceptible to having, wow, that experience felt really good. It's going to move right to the front of my priority list. Forget homework, forget hanging out with my group of friends that exercise, my group of friends on the basketball team. I want to party, and I want to repeat that experience, recognizing that it's always been difficult, I think, to be a teenager, but never before has there been the inundation of media, and never before has there been the normalized behavior, if you will, with cannabis legalization and medical marijuana and dispensaries everywhere. There is access and social reinforcement to using.
So when we had our mutual friend Donnie Wright here at our last webcast,
great,
he talked about the change in marijuana from, say, 30 years ago to today. Can you kind of briefly touch on that and talk about the level of potency and the different ways that marijuana can be ingested now?
Absolutely. So cannabis 40 years ago was between 3 and 4%. Good cannabis 30 to 40 years ago was 3 to 4% THC. 20 years ago, potent cannabis was between 8 and 12% THC. Well, a lot of the cannabis flower that's out there now is between 15 and 30%. There's been a huge impetus to create higher potencies over time. And over the last 7 or 8 years, there's been a progression of the presence of synthetic cannabinoids that are basically just numbers off of a list of synthetic cannabinoids that have been developed by pharmaceutical chemists over the last 30 to 40 years. Many of these are agents that are just sprinkled onto burnable material, and that's things like spice or K2 are sort of the popularized names. And over the last several years, the use of potent hash oil extracts, meaning hash oil or dabbing, has become a really popular way in which people ingest large amounts of marijuana, or large amounts of THC very quickly. Those extracts exceed 80% potency.
So if a parent has a concern that their child is using marijuana, what sort of signs should they look for?
Well, the overt signs of intoxication would be a child that has really red eyes, although there's a little bit less of that associated with vaping and dabbing because there's less burnable material, and so there's less irritation that takes place. Okay. Confusion, euphoria, mood change, most often change in reliability or the type of communication that a parent has become conditioned to expect will oftentimes not occur. There'll be isolation that will happen, and oftentimes there'll be a change in friends that occurs as well.
What do you think is the best thing that parents can say to kids now that it is legal for adults to use it recreationally and medically? And I think that there are going to be a lot of questions. I know there are already. Why is it different for me? I'm, as a kid. And what does a parent say? How to frame that conversation? And side note, what about parents who use recreationally? What kind of conversation do they have with their kids?
Great question. I think the most important thing is for parents to be truthful and open with their kids. Many of us got a message of just say no to drugs. And it seemed to be a pretty incomplete message. I know when I was a young adult taking risks and experimenting, nobody told me the why part. Mm-hmm. And what I like to say to parents and to teenagers is the risk of using drugs, particularly when you're young, is that you're going to like how you feel. Mm-hmm. And as a result of the brain chemical changes that happen, whether it's marijuana, whether it's alcohol, whether it's nicotine, whether it's other drugs, the risk is that your brain is going to remember that feeling, and that feeling and repeating that experience is going to become a much deeper priority in your life. Mm-hmm. And as a young adult, your brain hasn't developed yet, so you're far more susceptible to becoming more deeply attached. You're far more susceptible to experiencing damage that's oftentimes impossible for a young adult to really assess. Mm-hmm. We're talking about long-term effects, and I think many young adults are really, and a lot of studies suggest that their brain chemistry in adolescence and early adulthood is all about taking risks now and mm-hmm. all about immediate reward and gratification.
Right.
So I want to go back to the vaping and dabbing.
Mm-hmm.
In my youth, it was very clear when someone was smoking marijuana, there was an odor that went with that. What about when someone uses an electronic cigarette to ingest marijuana?
So it's my understanding that when people use electronic cigarettes that there's less of the odor.
Okay.
An electronic cigarette or some of the complex vaping tools out there heat the flower cannabis to just below the burning point. So it will vaporize the THC molecule and of the cannabis, but it won't specifically burn the plant matter. So there's less smoke, in short. And the same tools, the vaping tools, can be used for vaping hash oil. It's been my experience walking downtown Portland. You can still catch a whiff of that every now and then. Okay. But I think that it's probably a lot easier for a young adult to use and not necessarily be discovered.
If a parent does find their child is in that world at this point, what steps can they take to try to help them?
I think the most important thing is to not be initially punitive, but to really have an open dialogue about what's really going on, recognizing that I think many young adults are afraid to share what's truly going on. It's been my experience in the work that I do that when a young adult is, shall we say, outed or discovered to have been using drugs, specifically marijuana in particular, usually they've been using for quite a long time. If a young adult has their own supply, their own bag of weed, if they have their own pipe, their own rolling papers, their own vape pen, they've made a commitment to maintaining a supply. They've made a commitment to being engaged socially enough to at least have maintained access. So that lets us know that there's already significant attachment to using that particular substance. So that's important to recognize. I like to recommend that an open dialogue occur and then a third party be involved very quickly, and that third party should be a drug and alcohol counselor to perform an assessment so that an open dialogue can happen about where is that young adult at in their behavior, what is their openness to changing their behavior, and then creating some boundaries about what behavior changes can be insisted upon in terms of parents setting boundaries, particularly around things like cars, access to being able to drive, and rules about having drugs which are illegal for a young adult to have in a house, in a home.
Andy, thanks very much. We've come to the end. We've run out of time. If parents have more questions, we have a couple of different resources for them to go to. Elizabeth, where would you suggest they look to?
Well, for sure in Oregon City, we want to welcome people to the Oregon City Together website, which we'll put up on the screen. And we welcome them to be involved in whatever way works for them.
Great. And Andy, do you have some suggestions for folks that have questions about these issues?
I'm a huge advocate for the community helpline, Lines for Life, at www.linesforlife.org. Great 24/7 support for families and individuals in crisis. And people can always find information on the Hazelden Betty Forbes website at www.hazelden.org.
Excellent. Thank you very much.